The altar of God, which is described in Exodus chapter 20. It's actually described right after God gives his 10 commandments. And what's interesting here is that right after he describes the altars that he wanted the Hebrew children to build to him, he starts talking about Hebrew slavery. Now what's interesting about this is that so many critics will bounce right into chapter 21 of Exodus and start talking about Hebrew slavery, but they miss chapter 20 and the altar of God. Why is this altar thing important? I'll tell you why in just a second. God did not want us to fashion anything that would represent him. And that's because God is more powerful than anything on the face of this planet. He said, do not put anything on my altar that has any characteristic to anything on the planet. Not a tree, not a lion, not an ox, not a bear, nothing. He said, I am beyond all. I created all that. So I don't want you to surround my altar with my creations. If I want my creations to surround my altar, I'll bring them along. If I want a bear in my altar, a grizzly bear will show up, a real live grizzly bear. He said, do not fashion gods in gold and silver and anything like that. But here's the more interesting part. When God said to build him an altar, he did not want man-made tools. He did not want man-made tools to be used to build altars to him. Period. He said, if you build an altar of earth, do not use shovels. Use your bare hands. Okay? Because he wants you to get involved in this. Alright? But he doesn't want anything man-made. If you're going to make an altar, you make it with your hands. You don't make it with tools. If it was going to be stones, you weren't supposed to hewn the stones. Now what that meant was you were to take, most of them would take pickaxes and chop out stones and then put them up as an altar. God says, I fashion the stones. You don't fashion the stones. I fashion the stones, and you just put them as a stack of stones. He said, you find a stone, don't put a single tool to it. You just pick it up and put it on the altar. No hewing of stones. Why? Because it desecrated it. God was saying in essence, you don't fashion the altar, I fashion the altar. Now it gets even better. Because you were never to have any steps of any kind, whether you fashion them out of the earth, whether you fashion them in stone or anything, you were not to have any steps that led up to the altar. None. Zip. Zero. Zilch. That way you wouldn't uncover your nakedness. Now keep in mind that the Hebrew children at that time were wearing garments very similar to what a judge's robe is today. Now I said similar. I didn't say it was exactly the same. I said it's similar. Okay. This is just kind of giving you an idea of the kind of garment it was, and you can see Jewish garments of that period on the internet. Okay, and they look very similar to judges' robes or to ladies' maxi dresses. They look similar. You know, the design is kind of similar, but it's not exactly the same. All right, you'll see this when you see the pictures for yourself. So it basically, I'm just giving you a kind of an idea of kind of what it would look like, but then you'd have to actually see the pictures yourself to see exactly what it would look like. Okay, so they didn't really have pants as you would understand the term today. Okay, and these Hebrew children did not wear blue jeans. It didn't happen that way. So when they were wearing garments of this type, of course, if you took steps, then you'd reveal your feet, you'd reveal your legs, and God didn't want that. But what happens in our churches today We build altars of God. Yeah. Carve them out with knives, shovels, tools of all kinds. And it gets worse. If we're making them out of stone, of course, we hewn the stones. We do that. And then we make steps up to it. God said, no. When you're building an altar to me, you don't use steps at all. At all. Because there's not to be anybody superior in a church. The greatest of these is the servant of all. Is that how some of our ministers are acting? No. And you'll see this. If we're to have a true altar of God, there's to be absolutely no steps to it. None. It says it right here in Exodus chapter 20. What do? We make steps to the altar. And then on top of that, we fashion the altar with tools. Both are which are forbidden in Exodus chapter 20. Isn't that nice? Half our churches break two big rules in Exodus 20 right off the bat. Think about that. Now then, if we are to proceed on to Exodus chapter 21 briefly, you have to understand why people went into slavery in the first place. Usually it was because of debt. Heavy debt. They got themselves in a massive heavy debt and they couldn't pay it back. That's why they got into slavery. And what God is saying is that, one, you shouldn't get in that kind of debt in the first place. If God is your great supplier, you should not get in that kind of heavy debt. Because God supplies all of your needs. Not all your greeds, but all your needs. So if God's supplying all your needs, you should never be in this kind of situation in the first place. But he was seeing that the Hebrew children were emulating the behavior of Egyptian masters. Remember, these people had just come out of Egypt. And they had been observing how the Egyptian masters were treating their slaves. So they were starting to emulate what their Egyptian masters had done. And God was saying, whoa, wait a minute. You're not going to treat your slaves the way your Egyptian masters did. And so he laid out a whole bunch of guidelines on how to treat slaves. But the thing is, none of them should have ever been in that situation in the first place. None of them. Had it been an ideal society, there would have been no Hebrew servants or slaves. None. Zip, zero, zilch. It should never have happened. So that's why God made these rules. He's like, well, you know what? Dang it, you guys got yourself into a mess. Now I'm going to have to develop some rules so that you guys don't get into a bigger mess. All right. So that's what the slavery servant thing is all about. Hopefully you guys get this. But the biggest objection here is, why do churches have steps to their altars, and why are our altars fashioned with man-made tools, both of which are forbidden in Exodus chapter 20? Maybe we should start asking that question. Maybe we start building true altars of God, we'll begin to see that God had another way of doing things. Anyway, I just thought that would be interesting. I'll tell you more in a future video, so stay tuned.